Today I'm going to talk about Edward Estlin Cummings, aka E. Cummings, his early life. Born October 14, 1894 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to Harvard professor Edward Cummings and his wife Rebecca Clark. He attended Cambridge Latin High School and published the school's paper, the Cambridge Review, as well as learning Greek and Latin. He earned his bachelor's degree in 1915 and his master's in 1916, and his poetry appeared in the Harvard Monthly. He got his degree in modern poetry. Early adulthood. In 1915, that's when he received his Bachelor's of Arts, of course, and in 1916 he also received his master's. But in 1917, he enlisted in the Norton Hussars Ambulance Corps during World War I, which was in Paris. He drove an ambulance in Paris, but they didn't let him drive one until 5 weeks after he arrived. In 1921, he returned to Paris due to his love for the city that he developed during his time during World War I and stayed there for 2 years, up until 1923. Early writing career. In 1923, Cummings released his first book of poetry, Tulips and Chimneys, which was self-published. He received the Dial Award in 1925, which was a prestigious award, if you will, for up-and-coming writers. It wasn't for the big guys at the time, but it was something. Even after he received this award, though, he had great trouble trying to find someone to publish his writings, due to the fact that it was very unique and unorthodox at the time to have someone to play with linguistics just as randomly, if you will, as Cummings did. Poet and critic Randall Jarrell, the 11th consultant in the poetry to the Library of Congress, said, "One of the most individual poets who ever lived. But primarily, Mr. Cummings' poems are loved because they are full of sentimentality, of sex, or more or less improper jokes of elementary lyric insistence." Writing style. He used capitalization as an emphasis, and he wouldn't even capitalize his own name to humble himself. Here you see his poem, If Strangers Meet, and none of the words are capitalized, not even the letter I, which is more or less generally the rules of grammar. He didn't capitalize anything, which was weird for poets at the time because you followed grammatical rules. Next up, we have his poem Grasshopper, where he shows his unique linguistics. He formulated the poem to be shaped like a grasshopper leaping. And if you just take one look at it without knowing who this is, it looks like gibberish. It doesn't look like normal poetry. He spells grasshopper wrong. He adds parentheses in a random way. Like, it's not typical. So many people had a hard time understanding his poems because more or less they were like this. His influences. Pablo Picasso was a Spanish painter, sculptor, ceramic maker, and printmaker. And his unconventional art, such as the Rose period where he only painted using shades of red, and he had a Blue period where he only painted things using shades of blue, both of them lasted for 4 years, assisted in letting Picasso stand out and being remembered as one of the greatest artists of all time. Even today, you learn about Pablo Picasso in your, let's say, high school art class. In each of my 4 years, I have learned more about Pablo Picasso. Next up, we have Gertrude Stein. She experimented with the repetition of words and phrases, and she dismissed the 19th century trend of time-oriented writing for process-oriented literature, which means the teachers would usually give their students a subject to write about, but she didn't like that, so process-oriented literature became her thing, where it was basically free write, no range, no nothing. You could do whatever you wanted. You could add a emoticon to your poems or stuff like that because there was no rules. Like, To her, poetry was art, and it didn't need to be confined in such a small manner of how society views the right way to say words. Next up, we have Ezra Pound, who wrote about subjects such as history and politics. And he started a movement of poets to build different techniques and incorporate fragments in his writing. Again, this was not common. People used proper grammar in their writing. An analysis of the poet's work. An excerpt from My Sweet Etc. Etc., Wisters, etc. My mother hoped that I would die, etc. Bravely, of course, my father used to become a horse talking about how it was. A privilege, and if only he could meanwhile, myself, etc., lay quietly in the deep mud, etc. He's talking about war during this, and how his father said it was honorable, and society views it as honorable. But how honorable is it when you come home with PTSD, with injuries, with losing limbs? And he says his mother hoped that he would die because that was the right thing to do back then. If you were a young boy going into war, you came back home alive, you obviously didn't do what they wanted you to, which was to die for your country. His father was a soldier, but his voice would become so hoarse and deep and damaged, if you will, when he talked about how fighting for his country was a privilege. But it seemed as though to the narrator that it was a privilege forced upon you, and that the soldiers were brainwashed in a sense to believe that it was a privilege to go through all those horrible things. And if only he could meanwhile, my etc. lay quietly in the deep mud. Etc. It's those three dots used at the end of a sentence that isn't finished. And I think the author wanted to use it because it's not finished. There's something not there yet. And the deep mud, if you're ever in mud, it's heavy and thick, and the narrator's laying quietly there. He's basically being suffocated by all these ideas and views that do not match his. Next is I carry your heart with me, I carry it in. I carry your heart with me, I carry it in my heart. I am never going without it. Anywhere I go, you go, my dear, and whatever is done by only me is your doing, my darling. He's talking about love in this. It reveals only a physical barrier between the narrator and their love will separate them. And without their love, the narrator sees no point of living life onward, just like Romeo and Juliet. This narrator, he was most likely in a separate place from his love. So he says, I carry it with me, I'm never without it. I go, you go, my dear, whatever is done by only me is your doing too. They're basically conjoined because their love is that hard. Thank you for watching my PowerPoint. Here are the references. I hope you have a good day.